On a freezing December evening, Jacob decided to take a walk to clear his head. The streets were quiet, and the only sound was the crunch of snow beneath his boots. The world felt still and calm. The crisp winter air cut through his jacket, and he pulled the collar up, trying to shield himself from the biting cold. He was lost in his thoughts, unaware of the police car that had been slowly driving through the neighborhood. When the sudden flash of lights broke the silence of the night, his heart skipped a beat as the car came to a stop just a few feet away from him. The headlights illuminated the dark street, and for a moment, everything around him felt too bright, too real. Two officers stepped out of the car, their dark uniforms contrasting sharply against the pale snow. Their boots clicked loudly on the pavement as they approached Jacob. One of the officers was tall with a stern face, and the other shorter and more bulky. Both wore expressions that suggested they weren't in the mood for conversation. Jacob's pulse quickened, his mind raced, trying to figure out what he had done wrong. Was he walking too close to the street? Or did he fit a description? Jacob's hands tightened at his sides, feeling the weight of the situation building. Before he could say anything, the taller officer spoke. "What are you doing out here this late?" His voice was cold and demanding. Jacob felt a wave of nervousness wash over him, but he didn't answer, immediately unsure of how to respond. "Answer me," the officer barked. The second officer stepped forward and, with an air of arrogance, added, "You think you're above the law, walking around like this?" Jacob stuttered, slightly, trying to explain that he was just out for a walk, trying to clear his mind. But before he could finish, the shorter officer interrupted. "We don't want to hear your excuses. You're going to do something for us." Jacob blinked in confusion, not understanding what they meant. The officers looked at each other and then back at him. On the ground now, the taller officer ordered. Jacob's heart raced as he dropped his gaze to the snow-covered pavement. "What do you mean?" he managed to ask, trying to process the situation. "You're gonna do push-ups." The bulky officer smirked. "Right here in this freezing cold?" Jacob couldn't believe it was happening, but the officer's stares were unwavering. He hesitated for a moment, thinking about refusing, but the words the officers had said before echoed in his mind. "We'll take you in." The threat hung in the air like a cold wind, so Jacob reluctantly dropped to the ground. His hands felt the sharp chill of the pavement. As he pushed himself up and down, the officers stood above him, laughing at his discomfort, making cruel comments about how weak he looked as he struggled through each push-up. His arms burned, his body ached, the icy air biting into his skin. But the humiliation of it all cut deeper than the cold. His mind raced as he wondered how things had gotten this far. He felt small, powerless, and utterly humiliated as the officers continued to watch him without an ounce of empathy or care. Every push-up felt like an eternity as Jacob's body screamed in protest. His legs shook from the effort, but it wasn't just his body that hurt, it was the insult of it. All the degradation of being forced to perform a meaningless act in the middle of the night for no reason other than the officer's whims. Eventually, they let him stop, but not before mocking him one last time. "Next time you better think twice before taking a walk out here," one of them sneered. And with that, they got back in their car without a second glance, leaving Jacob shivering alone on the street, unsure of what to do next. Jacob stood there in the silent street long after the police car had driven off, its taillights fading into the distance. His body was numb from the cold, but it was the humiliation that burned the most. He could still hear their mocking laughter echoing in his ears as he slowly got back to his feet. His arms felt like jelly and his legs were weak beneath him. The sting of the cold air seemed to have penetrated deep into his bones, but it was nothing compared to the sting of what had just happened. He couldn't wrap his mind around it. What had he done to deserve this? Why had they singled him out? He slowly made his way back home. The walk felt endless. The snow underfoot seemed to drag at his every step. The lights of his house finally appeared in the distance, but they offered little comfort. Instead, all he could think of was the way they had treated him, the way they had taken his dignity. Without a second thought, as he reached his front door, Jacob fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking from both the cold and the anger he felt boiling inside him. Finally getting the door open, he stumbled inside and immediately shut it behind him, locking it as if to block out the world outside. But he couldn't escape the images of the officers standing over him, demanding push-ups in that freezing night. Jacob sank down onto his couch, his body trembling from the exertion and the shock of it all, but his mind was racing. What was he supposed to do now? What could he do? It wasn't just about him. He realized it was about what had happened to so many others who'd been treated the same way or worse by those who were supposed to protect them. How many others had been humiliated by these officers? How many had been afraid to speak up? Jacob couldn't let this go. It wasn't right. And the more he thought about it, the angrier he became. How could people who were entrusted with the power to uphold the law use it to break others down like that? It wasn't just about one man on a cold night. It was about a pattern of abuse. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts, reaching out to a few close friends who he knew would understand his anger as he explained what had happened. Their reactions were a mixture of disbelief and outrage. "That's messed up," one of his friends texted back. "They can't get away with that." Another said Jacob didn't know what to say to them. All he could feel was the deep sense of wrongness still lingering inside him. But their words gave him something he hadn't realized. He was missing support. He wasn't alone. Others were just as angry as he was, and they didn't want to let this slide either. But it wasn't enough to just be angry. Jacob knew that now, if he really wanted to make a difference, he needed to do something about it, something that would hold those officers accountable for their actions. But what could he do? He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a politician. What power did he have? Jacob stood up from the couch, suddenly feeling a surge of determination. He may not have had the power of the law in his hands, but he had something else. He had his voice, and he had the truth. If he could find a way to make people listen, maybe, just maybe, he could make a difference. Maybe he could turn this painful experience into something bigger, into something that would stop this from ever happening again, not just to him, but to anyone else. As he paced around the living room, his mind began to race with ideas. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time that night, Jacob felt a sense of clarity. He wasn't going to let them get away with this. He would fight for what was right. Jacob's mind spun with thoughts as he stood in the middle of his living room, the harsh fluorescent lights flickering above him. He couldn't just let it go. The more he thought about what had happened, the more he realized that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of something bigger, a systemic problem that had been festering for far too long. Jacob had never considered himself a particularly political person. He wasn't someone who regularly followed local government or police affairs, but now everything had changed. The officer's actions had ignited something in him, something deep and unrelenting. He couldn't stop thinking about the faces of those officers, laughing as they stood over him. Their power was crushing, not because of the uniform or the badge, but because of how they had used it to humiliate him without cause. If they could do it to him, how many others have they done it to? Jacob realized that his own story was just one piece of a larger puzzle. He had to act, but how? He wasn't sure where to start or what to do, but he knew he couldn't stay silent. The next day, Jacob started doing some research. He dug into the town's history, looking for reports of police misconduct or any past incidents involving the officers who had humiliated him. What he found was disturbing. Complaints about the two officers had been filed before. Allegations of excessive force, verbal abuse, and bullying, but nothing had ever come of it. They'd been reprimanded lightly or not at all. The system seemed to protect them, and that made Jacob even angrier. It was clear to him now that the only way to stop this was to make sure the truth came out, to make sure people knew what had been happening behind closed doors. He reached out to others in town, quietly at first. He didn't want to make a spectacle of it, but he needed to know if anyone else had experienced something similar. What he heard shocked him. Several people came forward, sharing stories of harsh treatment by the same officers. One man recounted being dragged out of his car for no reason. Another woman spoke about being arrested after a simple misunderstanding. Every story was different, but they all shared a common theme: police abuse that had been ignored by the department and the community. Jacob now realized that his experience wasn't just a one-off incident. It was part of a long-standing pattern. With the help of a few people who had agreed to speak up, Jacob began to document everything. He took notes, recorded conversations, and reached out to a lawyer for advice on how to handle the situation legally. It was daunting at first. He wasn't familiar with the ins and outs of law enforcement or legal procedures, but every step he took felt like a small victory. The more he gathered, the clearer it became that he couldn't just let it go. The town needed to know, and the officers needed to face the consequences of their actions. At the same time, Jacob began to feel the weight of what he was about to do. This wasn't just about the officers. It was about the town's trust in its police force. He wasn't just challenging the men who had humiliated him. He was challenging the entire system that had allowed it to happen. He felt a deep responsibility to the community, to those who had been too scared to speak up, to the people who deserved to feel safe and protected. Jacob had a decision to make. He could stay quiet and let the officers continue their reign of fear, or he could stand up and risk everything, his reputation, his safety, and his peace of mind, for the greater good. The thought of facing them again filled him with dread, but the thought of doing nothing filled him with even more. His path was clear. He had to do whatever it took to expose the truth, no matter the cost. The story was bigger than him now, and there was no turning back. Jacob's decision to take action wasn't an easy one, but it felt inevitable. With each passing day, the weight of the injustice grew heavier on his shoulders, and the more he learned, the more determined he became. The support he had started gathering from the community helped propel him forward. What had started as a personal vendetta had now transformed into a fight for accountability, a fight to make sure what happened to him wouldn't happen again. He began to make his case public, reaching out to local news outlets, hoping to shed light on the troubling behavior of the officers. At first, the media was skeptical. They were used to stories like these fading away quietly or getting buried under the weight of bureaucracy. But Jacob's persistence paid off. He contacted a reporter, a seasoned journalist known for uncovering corruption in local government. After hearing Jacob's story, the reporter didn't hesitate. "This is big," she said, "and it's exactly what this town needs to hear." The story hit the news the following week, and the response was immediate and explosive. The town was buzzing with disbelief. People were angry, outraged by what Jacob had endured, and yet, many were surprised by the depth of the issue. The officers' actions had been a dirty secret, something people had been too afraid to confront. As the story spread, so did the voices of others who had been mistreated by the same officers. Soon, Jacob wasn't alone in his fight. More individuals came forward, some with stories of verbal abuse, others with accounts of physical force used unnecessarily. Some even shared instances where the officers had used their position to intimidate or manipulate people for their own gain. The local authorities couldn't ignore the growing wave of anger, but they tried. The police department issued a vague statement claiming that they were investigating the matter internally, but everyone knew it was just a way to sweep things under the rug. Jacob wasn't deterred. He continued speaking out, meeting with anyone who would listen: community leaders, local organizations, and even church groups. He wanted everyone to understand that this wasn't just about one man or one incident. This was about a culture of abuse that had been allowed to persist unchecked for far too long. Soon, the town's residents began to rally behind him. It wasn't just people who had been directly affected. It was everyday citizens who were outraged by the idea that the very people meant to protect them could act with such cruelty. The local town hall meetings became packed with people demanding action, their voices rising together as one. Jacob was overwhelmed by the support, but he was also aware of the risks. His actions were making waves, and not everyone was happy about it. There were threats, whispers behind his back, and even a few suspicious cars parked outside his house late at night. But Jacob had come too far to back down now. The truth was out, and he wasn't about to let the fear tactics of those in power silence him. He knew the officers involved would fight tooth and nail to keep their positions, but Jacob had something they didn't: public support. And in a town like this, that could mean everything. As the pressure mounted, the police department had no choice but to launch an official investigation. The officers were placed on administrative leave, and the department promised full transparency, though Jacob knew better than to believe it. The officers would fight back, no doubt, but the tide was turning. The community was watching, and they were demanding change. Jacob had sparked something he hadn't anticipated: a movement. He had become a symbol of resistance, not just against the officers, but against the system that had allowed them to thrive unchecked. And with each passing day, Jacob felt a deeper sense of purpose. His mission had grown from personal justice to a fight for the future of his town. He wasn't just trying to hold two men accountable anymore. He was trying to change the culture of an entire community. The battle had only just begun, but Jacob knew he was ready. As the investigation into the two officers began, Jacob knew that this was just the beginning of what would be a long and challenging fight. The local news kept the story alive, with updates on the investigation and reports of new individuals coming forward with their own experiences of mistreatment. The more that came out, the more the town's faith in the police department began to crumble. The community that had once blindly trusted the officers to uphold the law now felt betrayed and vulnerable. Jacob continued to stay in close contact with the reporter who had helped bring the story to the public, as well as the lawyer he had consulted early on. The lawyer had advised him to stay patient, to let the investigation unfold, but Jacob's resolve only grew stronger. He knew that patience might lead to justice, but he also knew that the officers had powerful allies in the department and the town's leadership. They wouldn't go down without a fight, and the longer they could delay, the more likely it was that the story would lose momentum. He couldn't afford to let that happen. One afternoon, Jacob received a call from the local police union. It was an invitation to meet with them, an opportunity to discuss what had happened and the department's plans for moving forward. Jacob was skeptical. The invitation felt more like a formality than a genuine attempt to engage, but he agreed to go. He needed to know where the police stood, and perhaps more importantly, he needed to see if there was any real desire for change. The meeting took place in a nondescript conference room, the air thick with tension. Jacob was greeted by the union representative, a tall man in a dark suit who barely made eye contact with him. "Thank you for coming," the representative said, but there was no warmth in his voice. Jacob nodded, feeling a sense of unease. The officers weren't there, but their presence loomed over the room like a shadow. The representative started by listing off the department's achievements and policies, highlighting the officers' commitment to keeping the community safe. But Jacob wasn't interested in the platitudes. He cut in. What about the officers who've been abusing their power? The officers who humiliated me in front of everyone? His voice was steady but firm, and the room seemed to freeze. The representative hesitated, but then he shrugged, offering a weak excuse. "We can't control everything that happens. Sometimes tensions run high." Jacob's fists clenched. It was the same excuse he had heard from people in positions of power his whole life, a justification for bad behavior wrapped in ambiguity. "Those officers are part of a pattern," Jacob said, leaning forward. "This isn't a one-time incident. You've known about their behavior for years, and yet nothing was done. How many people have been hurt by them? How many have been too afraid to speak up because they knew nothing would happen?" The room was silent, and Jacob could feel the weight of his words settling in. For the first time, the union representative seemed uncomfortable. He shifted in his seat but didn't respond. Jacob took a breath, his eyes hard. The community is watching now. They're demanding accountability. You can't sweep this under the rug. Jacob stood up, ready to leave, when the representative finally spoke. "We'll take your concerns into consideration," he said, but it was clear that his words lacked conviction. The meeting ended shortly after, with no commitment to real change or meaningful action. Jacob walked out of the room, feeling a mixture of frustration and resolve. The conversation had proven what he suspected. The department wasn't truly interested in accountability. The officers who had humiliated him were part of a much larger issue, a system that protected its own, regardless of the harm they caused. Back at home, Jacob's phone was ringing off the hook. People from all over town were calling to express their support, and more individuals were stepping forward to share their stories. The momentum was building, and it was undeniable. But Jacob knew that this wasn't going to be easy. It was a battle against a system that had been entrenched for decades, and while the pressure on the police department was mounting, Jacob couldn't afford to get complacent. He took a deep breath and looked at the stack of papers on his desk, records, testimonies, evidence. It was time to step up again. He needed to make his voice heard even louder. The fight for justice wasn't over. It was only just beginning. As the weeks passed, Jacob's resolve hardened. The initial wave of media attention had started to subside, But he wasn't ready to let the story fade into the background. Despite the lackluster response from the police union, he continued pushing forward. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for the community, for the people who had been too scared or too disillusioned to speak out. The momentum was still there, but it needed to be sustained, amplified. Jacob began organizing a series of town meetings. He wanted to create a platform for people to share their experiences with the police, to provide a space where their voices could be heard without fear of retribution. He called on local activists, lawyers, and community leaders to speak at the meetings. It was a bold move, one that drew attention from every corner of the town. People who had been too afraid to come forward in the past found the courage to speak up. The first meeting was held in the town hall, and the turnout was overwhelming. The room was packed with concerned citizens, many of whom had never attended a public meeting before. Jacob stood at the front, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. "This isn't just about one person," he said. "It's about all of us. It's about our right to live in a community where we feel safe, where we're treated with respect." His words resonated deeply, and as the night went on, more and more people shared their stories of police misconduct, their voices trembling with emotion but filled with conviction. There were stories of excessive force, of threats, of people being intimidated into silence. There were parents who had witnessed their children being harassed by officers for no reason, and young adults who had been stopped on the street without any explanation. Each testimony was another crack in the shield of protection the police officers had hidden behind for so long. The department, once thought of as untouchable, was now facing a growing wave of scrutiny. Jacob knew this was a pivotal moment. The public outcry had reached a boiling point, and the pressure was now on the local government to act. That same week, the town's mayor called for an emergency meeting. It was clear that the situation could no longer be ignored. The public demand for justice had become too loud to silence. At the meeting, the mayor addressed the crowd, acknowledging the growing unrest. "We cannot and will not tolerate behavior that undermines the trust between the police and the community," he said, his voice firm. But Jacob wasn't ready to let him off the hook with just words. He had seen too many politicians make empty promises before. "We've heard the words, but what about action?" Jacob stood up, his voice cutting through the room. "What are you going to do to make sure this doesn't happen again? What steps are you taking to hold these officers accountable?" The mayor hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direct challenge. The room grew quiet as everyone waited for his response. After a tense moment, the mayor spoke again. "We are in the process of reviewing the investigation and will ensure that appropriate measures are taken." But Jacob knew that appropriate measures meant little without real change. "We need to see the proof," he said, locking eyes with the mayor. "You can't just say you're going to do something. You need to show it." The mayor promised a public announcement in the coming weeks, outlining the steps the town would take to address the police department's misconduct. Jacob wasn't convinced, but he knew that this was the moment to push even harder. The town was watching now. The power of public opinion was undeniable, and it was growing stronger by the day. Jacob wasn't alone in this fight anymore. He had the backing of the community, and the momentum was on his side. But as the town's leaders scrambled to figure out how to address the crisis, Jacob couldn't help but feel a growing unease. He had ruffled a lot of feathers, and the stakes were higher than ever. If the police department and those in power were willing to protect the officers at all costs, how far would they go to silence him? Jacob knew the next few weeks would be critical. It wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore, it was about survival, both for him and for the movement he had started. As Jacob continued to push for accountability, the pressure mounted on all sides. The police department, though forced to address the growing unrest, remained tight-lipped, unwilling to make real concessions. Behind closed doors, the officers who had been accused of abuse clung to their positions with everything they had. The public outcry was hard to ignore, but the power structures in the town were deeply entrenched, and Jacob's efforts to break through them were met with increasing resistance. Jacob could feel the tension rising in the air as the weeks passed. Despite the promise of action from the mayor and town leaders, little seemed to change. The officers remained on paid leave, and the investigation felt sluggish as if it were being deliberately slowed down. Every public meeting, every interview with the media felt like Jacob was trying to shine a light on a dark corner where people didn't want to look. But every time he tried, he was met with more resistance. It wasn't just the police anymore. It was the entire system that had allowed this to continue. Late one evening, as Jacob sat at his kitchen table reviewing the latest media coverage, his phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. Hesitant but curious, he answered. The voice on the other end was low, almost a whisper. "You need to stop. If you keep going, things will get ugly," the voice said before quickly hanging up. Jacob's heart raced. He stared at the phone in his hand, unsure of what to make of the threat. He knew this was a possibility. The higher the stakes got, the more desperate the opposition would become. But hearing it so directly was a stark reminder of how much he had put on the line. The next day, Jacob's worst fears seemed to materialize. The anonymous threats began to escalate. Strange cars began showing up outside his house again, lingering longer than they should. He began receiving unsettling messages on social media, threatening him and his family. The weight of the situation was heavy, but Jacob didn't flinch. He had come too far to back down now. His lawyer advised him to increase security, to file a report with the authorities about the threats, but Jacob knew that the local police were part of the very system he was fighting against. Who could he trust? The entire town was watching, but no one seemed willing to take a stand, not fully. Even those who supported him privately were often too scared to be vocal in public, unsure of what the fallout might mean for them. Despite the mounting fear, Jacob refused to be silenced. He began to push for a town-wide rally, one that would bring together everyone who had been impacted by the police department's abuse. He reached out to the local activist groups, human rights organizations, and legal teams that had been following his story. Together, they organized a march through the town, a march that would demand justice, transparency, and a complete overhaul of the police force. When the day of the rally arrived, Jacob could hardly believe the turnout. The streets were filled with people, families, students, workers, and business owners, all united by a shared desire for justice. Jacob led the march, feeling the weight of every step he took, knowing that this could either be the turning point or the end of everything he had fought for. As the march wound its way through the town, Jacob's heart swelled with hope. People held signs that read "Justice for all," "End police brutality," and "No more silence." The streets that had once felt cold and intimidating now felt alive with the energy of those who were ready to see change. But as the march came to a close, Jacob saw the flashing lights of several police cars on the horizon. The officers had shown up, not to join the peaceful protest, but to monitor it, to make sure nothing got out of hand. The town had reached a boiling point. Jacob could feel it in the air. This was no longer just a local issue. It was a fight that had reached far beyond the borders of the town. People across the state and even the country were beginning to take notice. But the question remained, would the town's leaders finally take meaningful action, or would they allow the status quo to persist, no matter the cost? The stakes had never been higher, and Jacob knew that the next few days would decide the outcome. The rally had been a defining moment for Jacob, but as he stood there watching the police officers line the streets, a heavy realization settled over him. He had sparked something far bigger than he could have imagined, and now the eyes of the town, and beyond, were firmly focused on him. The march, peaceful and powerful, had sent a clear message. The community was no longer willing to stand idly by. But the presence of the officers, their silent stares and heavy uniforms, made it clear that the battle was far from over. The town's leaders, sensing the growing pressure, began to make small gestures of support for the rally, publicly acknowledging the need for reform, but Jacob knew it was all just for show. The promises of transparency and accountability had amounted to little so far, and he wasn't about to let them off the hook. As the days passed, the investigation into the two officers continued, but there was no sense of urgency. The department seemed determined to drag its feet, hoping the public's anger would dissipate. Jacob refused to let that happen. His phone rang constantly. More threats, more support, more people willing to speak out. He couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something was brewing behind the scenes. The police force had too much power in the town. It wasn't just about the two officers anymore. It was about the entire system of protection they operated under. They wouldn't go down without a fight, and Jacob knew deep down that this fight wasn't just going to play out in the courts or the media. It would come down to who could outlast the other. Despite the mounting threats, Jacob doubled down. He hired a security team to ensure the safety of his family and himself. He continued to organize town meetings, calling on experts, activists, and even former officers who had witnessed abuse firsthand. Slowly but surely, his efforts were starting to turn the tide. More people, once silent, now began to speak out, sharing their own stories of mistreatment by the police. The town's landscape was changing. People were no longer afraid. Then, one fateful morning, Jacob received the news he had been waiting for. The mayor had called for an emergency press conference. This was it, the moment of reckoning. Jacob dressed quickly and made his way to the town hall. As he entered the room, the weight of the moment settled on him. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew this could be the turning point. The press conference began with the mayor standing behind a podium, flanked by other local leaders. He looked visibly shaken, but there was something different about him today. He didn't speak in vague terms or offer empty promises. Instead, he took a deep breath and addressed the crowd. "The time for silence is over," the mayor began, his voice firm but resolute. "We have failed this community by allowing abuse to continue unchecked. Today, we are taking action." Effective immediately, the two officers involved in the incidents with Mr. Jacob Roberts will be terminated from their positions. An independent review of the department will be conducted, and we will be implementing new policies aimed at rebuilding trust with our citizens. The room was silent for a moment before the applause began. It was hesitant at first, but grew louder as people began to process what was happening. The mayor wasn't just talking about reform, he was taking a stand, acknowledging that the system had failed and making a tangible effort to fix it. It wasn't perfect. Jacob knew that there was still a long road ahead. But this was a victory, a significant one. Jacob stood at the back of the room, a wave of relief washing over him. The fight had been long, and the cost had been high, but the victory was his, and more importantly, it was the town's. He had stood up to a broken system, and in doing so, had inspired others to find their voices too. But as he walked out of that press conference, he knew the real work was just beginning. The officers were fired, but the reform process would take time. It would take more than just a press release to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. Jacob wasn't going to disappear now. He had started something, and he wasn't about to let it die. As he looked out at the crowd gathered outside, Jacob knew this was only the beginning. He had fought to hold the officers accountable, but now it was time to fight for a safer, more just community. He had proved that one person could spark change, but it was up to everyone to keep that flame alive.